Hello, good evening, everyone. It's so good to be together this evening, and hello to people online who can't be in person. As Ramli said, I'm Danny Sriskandarajah. I'm Chief Executive of Oxfam Great Britain, and on behalf of all of my colleagues across Oxfam, thank you for joining with us to celebrate or mark this wonderful organization's 80th birthday. This is a fantastic event for me because it brings together sort of two aspects of my life that I really like. One is I've been a founding member of the Conduit, and over these years have really valued this space and the ability to be able to have these interesting, fabulous conversations, even with strangers next to you about the most topical things. And so that's one half of why I'm really excited about tonight. And the other is that I happen to work for Oxfam, and it's been a period of renewal for us, where we're trying to think of our role in the world, and so this anniversary comes at a really important point for us, and we wanted to have a conversation with some amazing activists who I'll introduce in a bit, but also you all, to get your ideas and advice about how to make change in an unequal world. And I said we turn 80. Some of you may not know, but Oxfam was founded on the 5th of October 1942, when 8 ordinary people came together in a church in Oxford, and were upset. They were upset about, or angry about, the fact that in Greece at the time a famine was looming. The policy of the Allies at the time was that food supplies couldn't be sent through into Nazi-occupied parts of Europe, and conditions were getting bad and people were dying. And these 8 people said that's not right. That it's unacceptable that people's lives were being lost when we could provide food aid. And they also, not just raising money to be able to provide food relief in Greece, but to campaign against the British government's policies, and successfully, over the next couple of years, changed the government's position on what was called total war. And over the last few weeks, as we've been marking our 80th anniversary, I've been thinking about the parallels between the world of those 8 people and the world we occupy today. There was war in Europe, famine was looming, hunger was rising at home and abroad. Fascism and nationalism was plaguing and dividing societies the world over. Public finances were a mess, and no one could work out how things, how we would pay collectively for the reconstruction that would have eventually been needed. And I could go on, but the parallels between that moment in history and today seem rather ominous. But on the other hand, I keep going back to what those 8 people must have felt like, that they came together because of their belief in the power of people to change the world. That these 8 people voluntarily, and stayed volunteers for years after that, came together and said, we must come together to challenge injustice and inequality, and did something. And the fact that they did something that has had a remarkable impact on history is amazing. They set in stone a process that led to the Oxfam we know today, an international network of some 21 legal entities around the world, with operations in about 80 countries, about 8,000 staff, one of the best known international NGOs. And so, to me, a remarkable reminder of the power that each one of us has to set in train things that we could never imagine, I suspect, how they might change the world. And yet, I also think that some of the assumptions they may have made at the time, they decided to have it was the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief. They thought the best way to address the situation was to formalise and register as a charity under English and Welsh law. They started employing people. They started a social enterprise. They started Britain's first permanent charity shop in Oxford, and we now have about 600 shops across the UK, and a booming online shop as well. And they set about making a set of assumptions on how they thought change would best happen. And it feels also like a moment when we need to rethink exactly how do we change this world for the better? And so tonight's conversation is about that. And I am really honoured to be joined by four amazing colleagues, activists, bad activists, tonight to help us navigate the conversation. But I will be coming to you for questions, comments throughout the hour or so that we have. To my right is Tori Tsui, who is co-founder of the Bad Activist Collective. What is a bad activist?
Thank you for asking. So, for context, bad activism emerged out of this notion that many of us in whatever movement feel entirely consumed by our imperfections, to the point where that hinders a lot of us from wanting to take further action because we don't think we're good enough. So, bad activism is a play on the idea that we are bad by virtue of being human, and it gives us permission to show up as we are, imperfectly, but still with a willingness to change and grow and show accountability. Brilliant.
Well, my board chair is here, and I think I need to explain to him now why I'm imperfect, and he needs to accept it. And then on Tori's right is Katie Stiles, who is one of an amazing network of activists who set up the We Care campaign to get society here, in particular, to acknowledge the importance of unpaid care to our life, to our society, to our economy. And Katie, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're involved in these issues because you look after your partner, and that means that you have to make some difficult choices to be here in particular. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'll speak a bit more later on.
Yes, thank you. And Imandeep Kaur, I first met a few years ago when she was running Impact Hub in Birmingham, a fantastic space that she'd helped co-found that was bringing together all sorts of fabulous actors and activists in and around Birmingham. And today she's the co-founder of Civic Square, another amazing initiative. Imi, before we start, can you tell us a bit about Civic Square, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to share more later, but just really briefly, we're interested in, similar to what you're saying, Danny, 80 years ago we understood out of the war we needed to build infrastructure for such a great transition when the country was sick and poor and broken, and we didn't just think about, shouting demands from Whitehall. We understood that you had to build the NHS to bring back health and well-being to a nation. When we did that, we built infrastructure at a national level, at a regional level, but crucially, a piece of infrastructure that we understood well, the neighbourhood GPs, created democratic access to health within a couple of miles, probably about half a mile from where you lived, which meant that we started to put the tools of that great transition into the hands of people. And so what we're particularly interested in is what that scale of infrastructure at the neighbourhood looks like in a time of climate transition, and what we would need to rebuild our public squares, our high streets, our neighbourhoods to really build on what we saw the best of in COVID, which was that our streets and neighbourhoods aren't just people living in them, aren't just peeps who can pick up litter and clean the snow. Yeah, those are great, important things. But actually, fundamentally, if we want to transition equitably, with justice at the heart, we need to put the tools of that transition into the hands of people where they are, so that they can gain confidence, skills, agency, exert their creativity, their mutual aid, their visions for the future. So just like the neighbourhood GPs, we're interested in what the neighbourhood infrastructure for the climate transition looks like, and that's what we're building at Civic Square. Brilliant, thank you very much.
And then Nick Dearden is the director of Global Justice Now, a fabulous network organisation that works on changing the systems that drive injustice in the global economy. And Nick was just saying before we started, told me a story I didn't know about Oxfam's involvement in Global Justice's birth. Maybe you could just share, please.
Well, it's a bit like you were saying, that it started out as a kind of poverty alleviation. And there was a lot of organisations at the time doing that, but they came to realise we were set up in 1970, and by then I think a lot of the big charities realised that you could continue giving charity for the rest of time if you didn't actually campaign to change the rules, the structures that were creating that poverty. you weren't doing anything particularly transformative. At the time, charity law prevented organisation, although, you know, to give credit, organisations like Oxfam still tried and got into trouble for it, which we should all be doing. But they set up us, Global Justice Now, World Development Movement at the time, to do that political lobbying, which was absolutely essential to removing the need for charity. And I have to say, I think you should be proud of yourself, because I think at a time where we've had a government which clearly believes that charities should, well, in the word of one MP, go back to your knitting, you know, that charity is what you should be doing. Oxfam have moved, you know, in the opposite direction and are doing far more now to challenge those structural and encroaching on our territory, which is great because, you know, we've enjoyed working with you. But I think it's absolutely essential that all of us say, you know, poverty is deeply political. And in order to get rid of poverty, you need to do more than give charity. You need to transform the structures that create it in the first place.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. So we've called this session Making Change in an Unequal World because, well, as Nick, you've just said, one of the things that we at Oxfam have realized in recent years in particular is this isn't, you know, the challenges we face in the world aren't just about poverty. It's, you know, we live in, you know, famine today happens not because of scarcity, but because of a sort of gross, vulgar misallocation of resources, including food, around the world. And I hope you will have seen some of the work that Oxfam has done around highlighting extreme inequality. You know, a handful of people, men, own more wealth than half the world's population put together. 92% of excess carbon in the air today is caused by the richest 10% of people on the planet. And I could go on about statistic after statistic that demonstrate that we're almost sleepwalking into an inequality crisis. And so if we want to address poverty, not only, as Nick says, do you need to address the sort of systems that drive it, but also I think we need to pay collective attention to inequality. And so that's why we've framed the question for tonight in the way that we have. And Katie, maybe I can start with you, because I didn't give you a chance to talk a bit about We Care campaign. But why is care such a relevant issue for inequality and the work or the campaign you've been doing?
Well, I think we all live actually in a caring society. We might not think that we do, but we definitely do, because we'll either need care or provide care. And that care is generally unpaid. And 75% of that unpaid care is provided by women. So that's the fundamental bits that I'd like to highlight. I think also we're talking about childcare, we're talking about care in the domestic home, and we're talking about, more relevant to me, is unpaid care of, in my case, my partner, but any relative that you may have, or your child, or whatever it is. So that's where it is unequal. We also, I don't think, value that care very well. During the pandemic, for example, carers were providing £55 million a day equivalent of care. But you don't really see that statistic. And over a year, that's equivalent to £193 billion in the UK alone. But we're not part of the economy. The economy measures GDP. It doesn't measure the caring infrastructure. And there's also, which isn't part of my campaign, but we're fully behind, those carers that are providing paid care. And you will know, I hope, that social care is absolutely imploding at the moment. There's 110,000 vacancies in social care. And I was just talking to Nick before, and we were both saying, well, why would you go into care if you can have a job in Tesco's for a lot less stress and more money? So there's that part of it. And so I founded a campaign, a grassroots campaign, because I got cross, actually. I was angry, like your founders, that this care wasn't being valued by political decision makers. And so before even you had Zoom, we held a Google Hangout call around my kitchen table, or 5 of us that created a core team. and we just went for it, which was brilliant. And we've had a grant from Oxfam. I ought to mention that. I called Oxfam out, actually. We had created a really good general election campaign that got us noticed. And I got invited to a round table about unpaid and paid care. And I quickly realised that I was actually the only person there that wasn't being paid, that wasn't a charity representative. And so I put my hand up very gingerly because I thought, God, this is Oxfam and they're massive. And should I say this? And I sort of said, why is it I'm the only person with lived experience in this room? And to Oxfam's credit, they took me under their wing and sorted me out and gave me a grant after I'd gone through a lot of loopholes. But yeah,
well, I'm glad you did raise the question. And let's come back to this notion of sort of professionalised bits of civil society. As I said, for Oxfam, we didn't have our first paid member of staff, I think, until we were about the 15th year of operation. And even today, it was remiss of me to say that I talked about the 8,000 paid staff we have around the world, but we have tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people around the world who volunteer to be part of Oxfam's network. And so, again, it's the sort of unconscious bias, perhaps, that I have towards the professionalised, salaried bits of social change that we often focus on. But let's come back to that. You talked a bit about the role of care in contemporary society, particularly around the pandemic. And there we were, many of us, clapping for carers only a couple of years ago. And I remember very early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, someone saying in the media, this is the great leveller. You know, we're all in this together. Any one of us could get COVID, and therefore this was going to bring society together. I suppose Katie, then Nick, how has that panned out?
I think it raised awareness of caring in general, which was great. But those claps for carers, I don't think unpaid carers felt part of. It was for our key workers, rightly so, but it didn't include us. And so I think also, at the time, our COVID was very different. It was a question right at the start of survival because all of our infrastructure had been ripped away from us. So all of the day centres, all of the support networks that we use for looking after somebody that's disabled or ill, we did not have. And, you know, it was a struggle just getting food into our homes because there wasn't the priority for unpaid carers or disabled people at supermarkets at the time. And I think I said to somebody, you know, my COVID wasn't all about baking sourdough and TikTok dances. It was pure survival. And I mean, that got better. And also I think people thought, you know, when we were all together and we were all at home, I think we did feel part of something. But then when everybody started to go back, it's only recently that my husband and I have stopped shielding, for example, and there's still people shielding out there that we have forgotten about, and they're a real voice that we don't hear, and that's just something that, you know, I'd like to remind you of.
Thank you. And Nick, on a global scale, how is the pandemic?
Well, I mean, it highlighted the inequality in the world to such a degree and exacerbated it. So, I mean, even in this country, if you are poorer or if you are from a black or brown background, you were far more likely to contract, to be seriously ill with and to die of COVID than someone who wasn't. So inequality in this country had a big effect. Around the world, it was so extreme. And the thing that we've obviously been working on was your access to vaccines and treatments, where essentially whether you had access to those medicines or not was entirely dependent on how rich and powerful your country was in the world. So while countries like ours was over-ordering, I mean, it ordered about 4 times as many vaccines as we needed, most countries in the world had absolutely none at all. We were actually taking vaccines out of southern supplies, the Serum Institute in India. And I think when we were getting 3rd and 4th doses, health workers in some countries hadn't even seen a vaccine. And the thing that I find really shocking is it wasn't just a matter of selfishness, which you can kind of understand, I guess, in a pandemic. We've got to look after our own first, was what some people said. That wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was that we wouldn't share the publicly created knowledge to make vaccines with factories and countries around the world that were capable of making them, because the sanctity of intellectual property law created by big corporations like the pharmaceutical industry in the 90s was more important than the right to life of millions of people around the world. That is utterly obscene.
Thank you. I think 97% of the costs of production of COVID-19 vaccines was footed by the public purse?
Some of them, yeah. And I mean, Moderna's vaccine, almost entirely footed by the American public purse. And now you have it's just disgusting, isn't it? I mean, Moderna and Pfizer in court suing each other over who owns that technology. The technology was created by public resource.
Okay. Tori, on inequality and climate change, how tangible or important are those links for the work that you're doing, for the bad activism that you're involved in?
Yes, thank you. It's really interesting talking about climate change, and in a time like this where a lot of people are struggling to put food on their table, and they're thinking about all of these different issues that a lot of people have argued that climate hasn't really taken precedence, which I'd argue that they're all interconnected. And something for me that I think with the idea of bad activism that I've been thinking a lot about lately is this idea of inherent perfectionism that we put on everyday individuals when there are corporations out there, namely fossil fuel industries, who have spent millions lobbying to greenwash, to buy politicians, to push forward climate policies which aren't very rigorous so that they can extract more oil and gas. And it just harks back to this idea that as a result, there are everyday people who blame themselves for living in an infrastructure where we cannot escape fossil fuels in many ways. And I think that that is a distraction. And what happens is there's a lot of infighting in our own movements. And so when I try and talk about bad activism, I try to remind people that we are human, first and foremost, but there are actively companies out there who are trying to stop you from living a life that is more equitable, more just, and more in line with 1.5 degrees of warming, which is what we're trying to achieve through the Paris Agreement. The other thing that I really want to touch upon here is that, I talk a lot about mental health and the climate crisis, and even the way in which we respond to the climate crisis here in what we would call the global north, to me, shows just how deep this inequality lies. And so, firstly, I'd just like for people to put up their hand. Have you ever heard of the term eco-anxiety? Yeah, quite a lot of people. Just for context, eco-anxiety is this recent phenomenon which has emerged to describe how a lot of people are fearful of the climate crisis and fearful of the future to come. And for me, that temporal element really speaks about the Eurocentricity of the term, because there are people on the front lines who have been experiencing trauma by virtue of what we call the climate crisis, but also the systems linked to it, namely colonialism and the extractivism that comes with that. Yet they're not aired or given the time of day to talk about these issues. And, all the while, there are countries like Pakistan which are currently underwater, and to hammer this home, a third of the country is underwater. That's more than the entire area of the UK. And to talk about something that my friend Ayesha Sadiqa said, she said, eco-anxiety to me basically spells out people in the global north fearing that their lives will one day look like mine. And that is really scary when you think about this idea that people are so anxious that it leads to this paralysis. And if you take it one step further, it leads to this concept of climate doomism. And what happens when people believe there's no way out? They hoard resources, they close borders, they start treating everybody else as a threat to their survival. And it's interesting you talking about this idea of scarcity, and you also talking about how prolific care is. And I believe in this concept of what this collective calls promiscuous care, that we're not limited in how much we should care, we're not limited in who we care for, and I believe that that's what's going to take us to creating a more just world and a more caring world in a time of climate breakdown, not one that is defined by authoritarianism, not one that's defined by the hoarding of resources, companies, paying off industries that are literally killing us and those most vulnerable and those on the front lines. So for me, that's kind of how I try to imagine a lot of it.
Thank you. Imi, I was going to ask you how inequality features in the work that you do, which you're welcome to answer, but I wanted to move towards the sort of approach that you've taken in this initiative, but others as well, around trying to address some of these issues. What are you learning about how we get cut through and social change? Because your approach is very different particularly from Nick and I, who are sort of working at the global level. It'd be great to hear a bit more about your model and approach.
I think this is batteries run out, so I might need to borrow your. Thank you so much. And yeah, I guess starting off, it was one of your colleagues that used to work at Oxfam, Kate Rayworth, whose work I came across, Donut Economics, which talks about the shape of an economic system that goes beyond endless growth as the goal and towards a more holistic dashboard of things that we would work towards, of which she speaks greatly and really sophisticatedly about the lack of the household when we look at what the market and the state exists for in the economy. And this, I came across his work a few years ago whilst I was at the Impact Hub. And the Impact Hub was this incredible local but globally connected movement of people, young and old, coming together we were riffing off a bit of a co-working business model to at least gather and start to organise in the city. For many years we crowdfunded the space. It was very, very accessible. It was buzzing every single day. It was incredible, right? It really was, and I don't exaggerate that because I actually miss it quite significantly now. But all the way through that, learning about the type of technologies, open source housing technologies, WikiHouse, which we were involved in, which got housing technology to millimetre precise precision that could build houses by communities all over the country. You could build a home within a week and it would be beautiful, and community could build it, and it could be on a community land trust and so on. And so years and years of energy and ideas and people and momentum and diversity. And so what? And I was like, okay, so what's going on here? And it goes back to that piece that you talked about, which is these systems underneath, which we term as the dark matter. The fact that you could have this housing technology, but communities haven't got any chance to get land to put that on. It isn't the house that costs everything, it's the land underneath it. It's a 400-year-old, steeped in colonial history, land contract that we have built. And this was all over the place, right? The goals of the economy, moving towards endless growth. Doesn't matter what we saw in the pandemic, we ended up back in the same place, because once you're out of that and you're hitting towards a certain goal, everything else is kind of collateral damage, including people's well-being and the well-being of the planet. And so for me, really, really fundamentally, I was like, well, what does this mean? What on earth does this mean? There's no shortage of ideas. In a city like Birmingham, there's no shortage of a convivial, diverse, multinational, beautiful convivial movement of people who are many of descendants who've moved here because of colonialism or the diaspora or so on and so on and so on. They have this rich, beautiful understanding of the interdependence of our globalized world and the challenges of the global south. And I was just kind of, well, what the heck do we do now? Why on earth is every high street, is every place not starting to transform itself to understand this? And that's where I started to really understand these systems underneath the surface that really need to be transformed. And actually, interestingly to me, I was like, well, I'm in the belly of the colonial beast. I'm here because my grandparents had to flee India after partition. What do you do within that? And from my point of view, I could see the ideas, I could see the people, I could see the energy. There was no shortage of them, but we weren't cracking through. We were actually often what felt like going backwards. And so actually some of the inspirations that I have taken from, despite the imperial backdrop of it, of post-war Britain, was a really interesting exemplar for me, which was that actually in the end, with all of these cascading crises that are on top of us, where we see the beginning of one, from food banks to the change in climate to time scarcity to care. You start to get to this point where people in their streets and their homes and neighborhoods are like, okay, so if I give up my plastic straw, right, and if I just do this, and it's almost you're completely disabled. And so for me, I really started to look at these ideas of when the community libraries were put into place, when neighbourhood GPs were put into the arc of a transitory time in society, and started to understand this quite deeply as an infrastructure moment, whereby we had to transform those unjust, unequal, in some senses just old systems that understood things like land, that understood our high streets through a certain lens of consumerism and consumption, in order to serve this economy that needed to continuously grow despite whatever it damaged on the way, and start to really dismantle some of these old ideas. And then something really particular happened. A very prominent Labour MP, who I won't mention who it was, said to me, like, the hub was thriving, and I was like, why is no one listening? She's like, nobody cares about these ideas on the doorstep. And I was like, oh shit, hold on a second. First of all, I was like, what's the doorstep, right? Because I wasn't in politics. So I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, you go and speak to the people that I'm knocking on the door of and ask them if they care about innovative housing and community land trusts and, this. And I was like, hold on a second, what do you mean the doorstep? These are people that you talk to that are also in the hub. Right, so I got really determined at this point, because what was happening is our movements were just being kind of pulled apart by another layer of, that's not possible, it isn't possible to do this. So then we were like, okay, let's go to the streets, particularly because I also, at the end of building the Impact Hub, everybody assumed that I would come to London, right? I would be on the track to become the next Danny, like CEO of something. Something in London, right? Like, that's what the NGO sector does. It says that's your direction. Get out of everywhere else and go to where everything's agglomerated and go. You're on track. You could be the CEO of yada yada, right? By X how many years. No disrespect to Danny. I very much appreciate your labour.
I just discovered both my chair and deputy chair are here. So if you want a job interview, you could do it tonight.
I'm very grateful for the labour of people like yourself, right? But I was like, hold on a second. This sort of professionalised change is also driving people to like leave their streets and neighbourhoods, and then creating this weird cycle where the politicians then tell you nobody cares about what you're talking about. And I was like, whoa, okay, I don't understand what to do. So we pulled right back. And we understood this idea of neighbourhood, the neighbourhood GP, the example of neighbourhood infrastructure, where the tools, the ideas, the energy, the education, the organising, the creativity, the mixture that sits on top of that, of mutual aid, of care, of everyday life, it plays out there on the street, it plays out there in the neighbourhood. We saw that in the pandemic. The best of us was in those neighbourhood WhatsApp groups. We're in those moments where we were going to come together. And I was like, cool. What happens if we take big ideas of climate transition, huge ideas of dismantling the land contract and this dark matter and financing in a way that was more equitable and just, and let's go right to the street and neighbourhood level. Let's encourage a decentralisation, a distribution of this work to go into the hearts of our inner city or wherever you think, but in our case it was an inner city neighbourhood in Birmingham, and started to build it out there. And guess what? Everybody on the street gives a shit, right? They care and they understand that their homes need retrofitting and insulating. They care and understand that the way that our systems are set up and how they can access land. They care and understand about wanting to biodiversify, wanting to do many, many things that they know are connected to the climate crisis, and they want to organise on their streets. And the final thing I want to say is that not to create this like strange local global, right, as if I'm doing the local, because I think your colleague Kate, she introduced us really clearly to tools that allow people to unlock what they already inherently know, which is this local global interdependence, this social ecological interdependence. Actually, we've kind of infantilized people by saying on the doorstep they just care about parking and they just care about this. On the doorstep they just care about this and they don't care about that. And what you find in a city like Birmingham, where many of us from 100 nationalities from all over the world, many diaspora, is that they understand really intricately this local, global interdependence, that there is no us here without an actual line of justice and injustice and the decisions we make here. So what we're trying to do really is to show that actually there's no shortage of energy. We've already got the ideas, the technology for this exists. Actually, when we start to organise in our streets and neighbourhoods and we understand this at a scale of infrastructure, that we can really unlock something whereby we understand this transition is going to take us a long time, and we haven't got that long time, and actually we can't just, with all due respect, we can't just stay in rooms like this, because it was just like if a Prime Minister at the end of the war turned around and said, right, could everybody get healthy, like really quickly, because we need to improve our GDP and productivity. People are just standing around being like, okay, what do I do? Like, what? And it's the same now. It's like plastic straws, no mome. Is there any, what shall I do? And so this isn't a story that we can just shout from the top down. We're going to have to decentralize our finance, our infrastructure, our way of organizing, and start to understand that so much of the assets that we need to organise and so much of how many crises play out are there to be seen on the streets you live in the neighbourhoods you are in, and we need to be able to organise from there, and we're trying to do that in a demonstrative way whereby we can start to build that sort of transformative infrastructure now.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to go to friends in the room and online, I think, as well. But before that, a quick round of ideas from you. So I said 80 years ago, 8 people came together and were angry and sowed the seeds of what would become Oxfam. There are, I don't know, 180 of us here today, and I can see lots of friends, activists, supporters of social change in lots of different ways. What should we be doing today? What are the clues from your respective experiences? What, if we were to be part of or initiate or pile on to progressive systems change around the world, what would we be doing today?
Making sure that people with lived experience of the issue are in the room. I think that's absolutely fundamental.
I don't know if that mic works. Is Katie's mic working? No.
Yeah, so making sure that people with lived experience of the issue are in the room. I've got to say that's fundamental.
Tori, Nick, hear me?
Making sure that we understand that we've got all the answers that we need. They're really inappropriately allocated, and our energy is often not in the heart of the places where we need to build these demonstrators and rehearse the future now. Like, we can start to rehearse the futures we want to live in wherever we are, and we need to do that boldly. And to remember one really, really key thing, that most of the systems that are holding us back from transformative change are not necessarily natural systems we can't change. They were rules that were made. 75 years ago, a bunch of people got together in a mountain and decided the beginnings of neoliberalism. Right? We can unwrite these rules. We can rewrite the land rules. We can rewrite the economic rules. And I feel like we are really fearful of being able to stand up, and systematically held back now, right? Like, there is quite a lot as to why people in charity can't speak up. But we definitely really, really need that to be true. And we have to believe that in this time of our organising, we can rewrite those rules. If we don't believe that, we are just going to be victims to whatever happens. But those rules were written. And the simplest way of understanding this is, I heard this 10 years ago, I've never forgotten it. I was standing in a park, and my colleague Alistair Parvin said to me, Imi, you know, land, he works on land, right? Land innovation work. Land isn't what you're standing on, right? That's soil. You're standing on soil. Land is a set of paper and contracts we made that sat on top of that around how we organise around it. Those papers and contracts can be ripped up. So can the goals of endless growth at the expense of human well-being and planetary health. These are things we can rewrite, and if we don't believe we can, we've already lost the game. And Arundhati Roy says we've got a world to win, and I think the way we privileged people can win it is get to that layer and start rewriting those rules.
Thank you.
I'd just love to piggyback off of that, and something that I try to practice is this concept of radical imagination. And radical in and of itself comes from the Latin meaning root, and that means really upheaving the systems that we have been led to believe are unchangeable, but they are entirely changeable. And, you know, it's interesting you talked about neoliberalism. Margaret Thatcher herself literally told the British public, there is no other option. There is. It's a lie. And I think that because of neoliberalism and because of all of these endowed values, we have been fed this idea that we are individuals existing as we are in this system, completely self-centered and selfish, but that isn't human nature. And it is not normal. And so my advice would be to practice radical imagination, but turn inwards to people in your community. Find people who lift you up and who believe in the same things as you, because you're so much stronger when you work together.
So yeah, I mean, don't be afraid of the fact that this is a political struggle we're engaged in. It's a collective struggle. I love your point about plastic straws. And, you know, one of my bits of hope was being at COP last year in Glasgow. 5 years ago, so many people would have been talking about lifestyle changes. This year, it wasn't like that at all. There were so many people, including like kids in school uniforms, basically, screaming about the need to change the system. So I think, and that's what gives me hope as well. I mean, you know, I've been doing this a long time, right? So back in the 90s, we wouldn't have been having a meeting like this in a place like this, essentially. There wouldn't have been amazing speakers saying what you've all said. To the, like, if anything remotely like this had happened, like, I'd have been invited as a real kind of extremist, just to show how far you can go, right? There is such an appetite in society for change. There is such an understanding that we need it. And so, you know, we've got to draw hope from that, because it is easy, like you were saying at the beginning, to get, you know, very doom and gloom about this and to be paralyzed out of action. I just see so much hope all around me in this country and around the world. If we have the staying power, if we get involved, and there's a million different ways you can get involved in this kind of activism, we really can change it. It's happened before, and it has to happen.
Well, unfortunately, Paul Van Zyl, who is one of the co-founders of the Conduit, just missed that point. Nick just said a conversation like this would not have happened in a space like this in the 90s, and so thank you, Paul, for creating a space that we can have these sorts of conversations. So over to you all for questions or comments. There's a hand pop right up over here, please, Romilly. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, and thank you for talking about hope. For a minute, though, I'm going to bring us back to doom and gloom, so bear with me for a moment. You know, what you said about people on the front lines and people who are bearing the brunt of, you know, sort of global, really insensitivity to things like climate change really resonated. So we've been involved with sort of community response to the floods in Pakistan, and the situation there right now is really that, you know, people are using mosquito nets while mosquitoes, you know, bringing swarms of mosquitoes bringing dengue fever are flying over these swathes of water for their livestock, because they say, okay, you know, we'll be okay, but what are we going to do without our animals? And if you look at the response to flood appeals, I don't know, Oxfam flood appeals on social media, they're mind-blowing. They're really shocking. I've never seen it before, really. The level of just this lack of shared humanity, and people saying, well, why should we care about that? Or aren't they terrorists anyway? And I really, you know, thought we were heading towards a better world, you know, maybe 10 years ago. But how now can we make change in a world that's not just unequal, but is really fractured? It's not just about writing the rules at the top. Public perceptions and people are just so polarized.
I think I first want to frame this contextually within the sort of global responsibility for climate change, in that Pakistan only contributes 0.4% of global carbon emissions, whereas countries like the UK have been historically emitting carbon much longer than anywhere else. Something I first want to say with regards to that, it is heartbreaking, the individualized responses to it. But something that I find equally as distressing is that as a country, reparations have not been paid. This is an issue of not charity, it is an issue of reparations. These people deserve to be compensated for not only the political terrors that have been inflicted upon them, but also carbon emissions from the global north. And so, unless our government starts to act accordingly, its citizens will not care either. And so I would put an onus on the government to do more to support these nations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pretend that everyone's on our side at all. We are very polarized. I mean, that's the nature of the political struggle that we're engaged in at the moment and how serious things are. So, I mean, it is very frightening. All the more reason for us to get involved, right? But I also think you can look at history and you can look at, for example, I mean, we didn't have social media, right? But when we created the NHS in this country, it was contentious. I mean, there was a huge political battle about it. You know, Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, a massive political battle about that. Any great change has created that political battle with people of all classes and backgrounds on both sides to some degree. So that is happening, and it is very frightening, and there's no guarantee that things are going to get better. I think that but it is so it's important to be realistic, but it is also important to remember that there are many, 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 many people who do not think like that. There are many people who think differently, who are doing things differently, who are engaged in this same struggle as us, and to try, it's easy for us also to get into our little individual, like, let's sit and look at what's going on social media. It's a very depressing thing to do. Like, I really try not to. Whenever I go on Twitter, I'm like, it was a terrible mistake. I feel awful now. So, it is, and that's also why I know it's been difficult with COVID, and I know not everyone can do it, and we've got to remember that, but coming out and being part of collective mobilizations, collective processes, and if you can do that, if you can only do it online, is really, really important as well, to remember that there is a huge amount of people who want positive, progressive change, who want a more humane world, a more equal world. And I also am very lucky in my job because I do see that, the amount of people who contact us, desperate for change, who want to be part of a community, who want to be part of a movement. So don't give up. That's the most important thing. If you give up, they've won.
Just at a point, I suppose, about the radical imagination you talked about, Troy, because so if you go back 80 years when Oxfam was founded, there was no such thing as an international aid system. And I don't think our founders would have dreamt that there would be this official development assistance system that provides, give or take, about $150 billion today. That's not enough. It's deeply problematic. But the world is a better place that there is such a system. And I think there is a parallel today for the same radical imagination that's needed to finance global public goods, including resilience to climate breakdown. And exactly as you say, the people who are being hurt today, whose lives and livelihoods are being ruined by climate breakdown, people in Pakistan, or the amazing people I met a couple of weeks ago in Somalia who are facing the worst drought in 40 years, a drought that's been driven by climate change that they had almost nothing to do with. But I think there is an opportunity here to say, what is the global financing mechanism for that, for dealing with for dealing with climate breakdown, and one that's based on justice or climate justice, not just charity. And I think it shouldn't be beyond our collective wit to imagine the sort of radical imagination needed for a new system for dealing with this. There's a lady waiting patiently in the back there.
Thank you. You guys are very much speaking my language, so thank you so much. I have a question around kind of seeing that deluge of negativity that exists around all of us as we do this work. And something I've been speaking to in my community of activists and changemakers is this idea of not becoming consumers of crisis and not being put in a constant state of fight or flight to the point that it burns you out. And how changemakers burn out and are experience a higher level of sort of mental health issues, burnout, suicide, etc., either physical or resulting in chronic physical illness as well. So I'd love to know how each of you sort of curates your own diet of what crisis you, I hate that I've used that language, but you get my point, that what do you buy into that drives you forward and not buy into the things that turn into rocks that pull you down? And how do you do that yourselves? And then how do you work with your community to make sure that that's what's going on?
Great. Anyone?
If I'd like to start. So as an unpaid carer, I'm pretty burnt out all the time. We have not had a break I personally haven't had a break for 8 years. So, you know, it's just that you just keep going and the momentum keeps you going. I also find that part of our campaign is giving carers opportunities to speak to decision makers, training them up, getting them in those rooms, telling their truths and giving solutions. And actually there's nothing better than actually a carer delivering on all of that and then coming back to you and saying, Katie, I couldn't have done that 2 years ago. You know, you've made a real change. We Care's made a real change. So that's what keeps you going. But in terms of resilience, well, I think carers are the very definition of resilience because we have to keep going no matter what because there isn't an alternative. And so I'll just throw that out there, that actually for some of us we do just have to keep going. Don't do as I say, do, you know. Occasionally I manage to read a book or have a long hot bath or something like that. So it's go for a walk. Actually, you know, being grounded in nature really helps, but, you know, that's quite rare. But coming out something like this will keep me going for many, many months. So thank you.
I could definitely share a nice story, but I don't think I'm going to. Because of who we are in this room, right? So for me personally, I dig from a different well, right? So I think for a lot of people whose parents or grandparents descended from the global south, we have different value sets and ideas of care, of the village, of who we are, and a well of stories that our parents and grandparents unfortunately went through in the partition and in many other things from my personal experience that allow me to draw from a different well and to understand my time here on this planet as perhaps not so individual. That doesn't mean I need some sleep or I don't need to do nice things and don't need people around me. But the reason why I say this is because I definitely am going to just be really honest that I think we have a huge battle on our hands. And so many of you in this room are silenced. Your organisations are silenced. We are being deplatformed if we talk about anything that criticises this current government. This is not like a fair game, right? We're not in a time where you might be on the side of a political story that you don't quite necessarily agree with and the other side's a little bit different. We're literally in one of the most corrupt, criminal, difficult times that we will ever all experience. And therefore, from my perspective, it would be disrespectful to what my grandparents and parents did and what they had to go through, to sort of sit back at the moment and think about my own privilege within that as, I mean, damn freaking right, we deserve some rest. But I don't think that's what this generation's going to get to do. I think we're a little bit too comfortable. I think we're a little bit too safe. And I understand that we need to be in networks of solidarity and care with one another. We have to be good at being bad activists. We have to understand that solidarity will... Arundhati Roy talks about this really well, figuring out how we are going to have solidarity. But that solidarity requires us all to get uncomfortable and understand the scale of the fight that we are in. We are fighting for the future of a viable planet, right? We are fighting for the future of whether this country is going to close its doors once mainland Europe is experiencing the peak of the climate refugees that are going to come. We are fighting for how our children, our grandchildren, how our peers, how our neighbours will respond in that time. And so from my perspective, I think the single biggest thing you can do to support your own burnout is to, in everything that is oppositional to the current government, oppositional to whatever, is to have proposition, is to always have proposition. What are we fighting for as well as against? That really prevents a lot of burnout in our communities. That, you know, for every XR protest or whatever we're going to be going to, how many more things are we proposing? How many more futures are we rehearsing and practicing today? How much more at our street or neighbourhood level or with our neighbour are we starting to really get into the nuance of that? But I do want to say that I think white British people need to get a real frick ton of less comfortable and have to stand up, and it might be difficult and the Charities Commission might be down your neck and there might be a lot of things going on, but this is a political battle. This is a battleground for the future of any kind of viability and any chance to be something useful to the global south, to help clear up the mess we've created. And so for me, I have to dig from that different well, because if I do in this consumer self-care world, like try and put this battle in there, it doesn't work. It fundamentally doesn't work. So that's how I keep myself going. Obviously, get some good sleep and like walk in nature and look after the people who are doing so much unpaid care, right? Because the reason why that is such a disaster is because our economy doesn't value that, right? So of course we've got to do everything we can with our privilege for others, and I think that's a fairly I think it's harder to feel burnt out when you're in that hope and in that momentum in these times. I think if you're in inaction and unable to hold on to something, that will create a far deeper like level of burnout that we might not recover from. So yeah, I'm in that space, and I think we need other stories to drive some hope and inspiration from.
Thank you. Just go to Tori very quickly.
Sure. I really agree, and I know it's uncomfortable to hear, but people need to get used to being uncomfortable, and I think we don't understand the scale of what's to come a lot of the time. And I already mentioned it with eco-anxiety. We're seeing people in the global north lament over a future that is to come while people are already enduring the hardships. And, you know, I've seen a lot of people weaponize the words of black feminists to justify sitting back and not doing anything. Something that comes to mind is Audre Lorde's, you know, self-care is an act of political warfare, and it is, but that is reserved for people who live, breathe, eat resilience, and who live in a racist world where they are constantly challenged and constantly burnt out. And we need to stop co-opting those messages that have been made for people who are marginalized. And we have, each one of us in this room has a responsibility as well to acknowledge the privileges that we do have. And, you know, it's all well and good me sitting here and talking about Pakistan, but like there are literally people whose lives have been completely destroyed. And that is just unfathomable. So I would say yes, like we need to do the things that can nourish us, but we need to see this as a sustainable fight as well. We need to get uncomfortable. We need to know that we can do this for the long run, because it's not going away anytime soon.
Thank you. So I'm going to take 3 questions or comments. There's one there. And then
yeah, I didn't really have a question, but I wanted to, kind of give a comment on how to deal with people who say, well, not really deal with people, but I think a big thing is about bridging these worlds of those who say, yeah, well, aren't they all terrorists as well? And I think this is something we need to think about. How do we bridge this gap of the understanding of those who do constantly give and try to make a more equal world with those who don't? Because by bridging that, obviously, it would be tapping into such an immense collective power. And I mean, personally, I've been thinking about it, and I thought, in that way, education comes in as well. And obviously everyone needs to pick their battle, but yeah, teaching in schools more those kind of soft skills which maybe in a more isolated world, which through technology has been fostered, kind of get lost, like empathy. So if you see this, not immediately thinking, oh, do they deserve that because are they terrorists, but really seeing, no, this is something that's terrible that's happening to them, and am I in a position to do something about that? And yeah, and I think also that draws back into what was said earlier as well, where everything is interconnected, because I think as well, a lot from this attitude to like, oh, is this my problem, really comes again from the, I think, eco-anxiety, which was mentioned earlier as well, like by having the outlook, oh, everything is going down anyway, so should I do something, because it doesn't feel like a lot is changing, and is there hope at all, and if there's no hope, should I not just enjoy life in that? So yeah, like coming like to the problem from a different angle, really. Yeah, so not really a question, but more a comment.
No,
sorry.
thank you. Hifsa in the back.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Hello?
There's a mic coming to you. Paul, you need to get new mics here.
Hi, is that any better? Oh, definitely. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I was really in two minds about coming out straight after work. I'm really glad I did, because listening to you all speak, I've just really been inspired, and it does make you realise you're not alone in wanting to make that change. So thank you for everything that you have done and everything that I know you are all going to continue to do. I just want to pick up on something that I think more or less all of you have talked about, and that's that, you know, this is a political struggle, and we have to have the political will in order to make change and change the system. And I'm talking about political will both with a small p and with a big P. I'm going to ask you all if you could tell me what one thing would you like to see our political parties committing to in the build-up to an election that would really make a difference?
Hiya. Thank you all so much for today. Really enjoyed the talk. Two themes that came across to me from all of this were having the bravery to challenge, receive wisdom about how we do things, and also putting power into the hands, giving agency to people who understand their situation better than anyone else externally. Recently, we've seen a rise in popularity of charities promoting work for giving people cash directly, putting cash directly into people's communities, into their hands, their lives, promoted by groups like Give Directly and Rory Stewart on the Rest Is Politics podcast. They point really to two key things. Number one, they point to evidence that suggests that giving cash directly to these people is having a pretty immediate positive effect on their lives. They're spending it well in the vast majority of cases, and it's having a real positive impact. And secondly, I think it's fair to say they do sometimes criticize how, with big traditional charities, a lot of money goes into paying people whose role it is to go to a community to formulate a strategy of what this community would need best, and then work out where money would go from there. And they're basically saying, well, why are we paying so much money to the middleman when we could just put it directly into these people's hands? So I suppose my question is, what's Oxfam's view of cash-in-hand strategies for charities? Is it something you would do? And secondly, do you think some of these criticisms are unfair or maybe exaggerated about the real process of things? Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you for bringing the institutional elephant in the room out to bear, because I do think there is a question around, and I'd love to hear from others, as well, from you all, about what is the role then for the professionalized, institutionalized bits of civil society, particularly, you know, when you're working as an unpaid activist, volunteer, carer all at once. Anyone else who's really keen to make a point before we close this bit of the conversation? And Paul would like a point. Is there anyone else? We've got about 10 minutes of this bit. Okay, you'll have to all be promised to be very brief.
I just want to say a very quick point on the last point, which I thought was very well made. There's been a lot of response, almost all of it wholly inadequate, to the Grenfell tragedy. And one of the, in response to about 1,000 people being surveyed in response to what has been most effective, community member after community member has said, direct cash transfers into the hands of people, which give them autonomy over their spending and be able to, in real time, respond to their real needs, is by several orders of magnitude voted as the most popular program implemented in response to it. So in our neighborhood, not too far away, in one of the most unequal square miles in Europe, their evidence suggests that this is something that really, really works.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a bunch of other hands going up. Emily, there's one there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hi. First, to say thank you to you all for sharing your insights and your wisdom and your experiences. And I think one of the kind of tensions that has come out so beautifully tonight is the fact that if we need radical and transformative alternatives to the systems, they need to be local and they need to be meaningful to the people whose lives are affected. So how, in a system where most of the solutions that were given and floated are professional, how do we get more people hearing from the local and meaningful experience rather than the professional solution that creates demobilized kind of giving? I think that's something that's really stuck with me tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. It's on that theme of the different delivery models, and there's been a couple of very interesting ones just mentioned. But briefly, what role does each of the institutional non-profit, the social enterprise have to play, and big business itself in actually looking at that question of how do you make the change that we need?
Thank you. Last question, comment? No? Okay. So, I'm going to be really unfair and ask you to choose one of those questions because we've only got about 7 minutes of this bit left. But the point of bringing this group together in this sort of space is that conversation, this conversation can keep going. There's a bar at the back and there's plenty of space upstairs that we can keep talking about this. But can I ask each of you, please, to come back on any one, maybe one and a half of those points that you'd like to finish us off on?
There was a question about, what political change I would enact. And for me, as a climate activist, I'm thinking about the UK government trying to open a new oil and gas field in the North Sea called Rosebank, which they claim will help lower our energy prices. It will not. Renewable energy is currently 9 times cheaper than oil and gas. So don't believe the lie. It's not true. And for me, that is in line with creating a more equitable world, helping workers transition to a just renewable future as well, creating new jobs for people across the country, and also making sure that we are staying within 1.5 degrees of warming, because currently we are not. And, as I mentioned, the UK is historically one of the largest emitters, so we have to do right by our communities here in the UK, but also by the global south.
If I speak to the points about people with lived experience versus an NGO, I think the role of the NGO is just to give over their power. I've got to say that Oxfam have done that beautifully with We Care. We have walked through the doors that we would never have got through in Parliament. And that's because of the power of Oxfam and their name, and the fact that they've put some money where their mouth is. And so it's not about them telling us what the solution is. We know what the solutions are. My colleagues have said that. It's about giving us the opportunity to tell others about those solutions and say why they actually work, because we know, we've seen most of them not work. So there's that.
I find picking on one of these really hard because, and I will stick to one, because that whole story that just emerged there is an interdependent one, right? And so the first thing I'm just going to say is we have to hold the ability to hold a couple of thoughts together at the same time. Like, otherwise we get into binaries that personally I think is the wrong question. So I think what you've just said about the cash in hand is fundamentally linked to what I said before. There's a breakdown in the social contract. everything that we knew to be true about what happened when you finished school, went to work, or that you went to university or you studied. This is fundamentally breaking. We are going to be emerging into a new compact of how society can be together. And within that, of course, we have learned over and over and over again that something equivalent to the basic income, something equivalent to a new social contract is going to be crucial. 2 weeks ago, 150 billion, 150,000 million pounds has gone from the public purse to the energy companies to give us all a small respite on brutal bills that are going to completely destroy many people's futures. We have done so many moments of these large cash transfers, an emergency moment in society, that we have to be at a moment where we understand that to be fundamentally like a new way to organise our society, and that work isn't associated with your literal ability to survive. Like the cost of living is just completely bizarre, right? Cost of living, the cost to stay alive. These ideas are going to be broken down in this transformation. We have plenty of examples of this. 40,000 million pounds went to the track and trace. That scale of money, we don't even understand what's happened with it. So for me, that question is right. Cash in the hands of people is fundamentally going to be part of this next transition. It has to be, right? But at the moment, do I think, if you look at the numbers, like, do I think dismantling the only part of civil and social society and civic society we have in this battle right this second is the right conversation? Not really. I think everybody should be thinking about salary ratios. Everybody should be thinking about the basis of their ratio between operational costs and money that is going out to the front line. But I have a feeling if you stack up all the 150,000 millions, 40,000 millions, millions, Bank of England, billions, right? And what's happening over here? They're out of sync. This is about a fundamentally new social contract. I think these sorts of rooms need to have better level of conversation, if I'm honest. We need to unpack these Daily Mail articles, these Daily Mail stories, and if anything, right, yeah, hold our NGOs to account. I mean, I'm literally left international development because I saw it as colonial project 2.0 around the world, right? So I'm not here being like, woo, let's like all just carry on without any accountability. But what we're talking about here is two very different worlds. It can be true that cash needs to go into the hands of people, everyone, pretty much everyone, very quickly to transform the stories that we're in. And we've got terrible examples of this in society over the last 4 or 5 years. And it can be true that just like the right-wing project put billions of pounds into the leaders who have now pushed that across the media and across, for example, what created Trump and all that, that the equivalent progressive new economy story also needs to uplift its organisations, its leaders, everything. And I think we shouldn't conflate these two because we then are in a zero-sum stack where the numbers don't just stack up. That doesn't mean that I think NGOs, charitable sector, social sector does not need to be held to account, but I think the numbers are way out of sync, and we're going to have to talk about a new social contract, which definitely involves putting cash into the hands of most people, at least 90% of society in the coming years.
Thank you. Nick.
So our organisations were formed in a completely different time, right? When we had a kind of social democratic contract, when we had a welfare state, and I do agree that we've got to radically transform what our organisations are. One of the reasons I think people feel so anxious, so desperate, is precisely neoliberalism has torn apart our communities, the structures that a previous generation were part of, and we would have been part of those structures, but only one small part. You know, you'd also have had the trade unions, the Labour Party, you'd have had working men's clubs, blah, blah, blah. And one of the reasons we're anxious is not the amount of, I'm not speaking for everyone, but for a lot of us, it's not the amount of stuff we're doing, it's the fact that we're so isolated in the way that we do it, and we're reflecting on what random people are saying in Twitter rather than drawing strength from our communities that often don't really exist anymore. So in terms of how we transform ourselves, it is giving power over, but it's about how I think our organizations can play a role in recreating those communities and infrastructures, or helping others to do that work, because that's essential. The fact that you can't really have a meeting in most towns around this country anymore unless it's kind of mediated by the market, unless you pay for it, is a problem. That wouldn't have been the case at one time. So how do we recreate that? Because that's where strength's going to come from. And I think as part of that, we've got to give people hope. So in terms of the party political, I think a Green New Deal is a fairly good shorthand for what they need to offer, but the devil is in the detail as to what that means. But essentially, for me, a Green New Deal is about the transformation of society to deal with climate change, but by way of dealing with inequality and all this kind of stuff as well. And that has to be done in a way that is forward-looking, that gives ordinary people hope, and that aligns their interests with the interests of people in the global south. I do think you've got to do that. I don't think you can just go out and say to people they're the problem. You have to give people a way of aligning their interests with a better society. And that's not going to be more material possessions, obviously, but it is going to be about having a better life on an equal planet. And yes, I would love to see a political party offering that. I'm not sure which one is going to offer that at the moment. I know which one isn't going to offer it very, very firmly. And that's just one I will end on, that hope, because for me, my hope has gone up dramatically since Liz Truss became the Prime Minister of this country. Because I think people can see she's a fanatic about the free market mechanism, which has destroyed our communities and handed over all of our power to big business. And people can see that now. It's stripped away and it's bare. And I think that, therefore, we have the potential now. We have the potential for real change. People are very, very angry. Yes, they're afraid. But if we can give them hope, if we can give them support, if we can give them the infrastructure through which they can begin fighting back, I genuinely think now we could be looking at a very different situation within the next 5 or 10 years.
Thank you very much. I never imagined you'd say that, Nick, but I was told to wrap things up at 7:45. That was 3 minutes ago. So let me try to be very brief. I'll answer the question around Oxfam's role and approach to things like cash. To say, I think the point you made and the point Paul made both relate to something that we're learning and have tried to integrate into our new strategy, which is, for charity to be effective, for philanthropy to be effective, it has to be about agency, right? Gone are the days when you can have this sort of patronizing model where you say, we're going to collect resources from, well-off donors and give them to needy beneficiaries. That was never a great way of doing things, and it cannot be part of a thriving, successful civil society. And so things like cash are an embodiment of how to do that in a more empowering and efficient way. And Oxfam, like many international agencies, intergovernmental agencies, are using cash increasingly in humanitarian and other contexts. But for me, there's something that's much deeper than that, which is, for me, best put by an Australian Aboriginal academic activist called Lilla Watson once said, which is, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because your liberation is bound up with my liberation, let's work together. And to me, that's got to be the ethos. And I think each of our panelists have talked about a different aspect of that ethos, of mutuality, of solidarity, particularly at this moment across borders, across societies, that's much needed. And that's the basis on which we're trying to sort of take Oxfam to the next stage of its evolution. And we may end up looking very different in terms of institutions and size and shape and structure, but we hope to stay true to those founding principles of compassion, of indignation, of solidarity, of action, and importantly, speaking out. And that's, I suppose, several people have said here on the panel and in the audience about one of the worrying aspects of the world we find ourselves in is some of those assumptions we made about the centrality of civil society, the importance of the freedom of expression, of association, of assembly, are also being chipped away at in every part of the world. Only 3% of people on the planet, according to the Civicus Monitor, live in a society where civic space is genuinely open. And we are not part of that 3% in this country, according to the Civicus analysis. And so there is also a moment when we have to build a more effective set of civil society actors, some institutional, some voluntary and informal, but together also stand up for the right of us as citizens to organise, mobilise, speak out, take action. And that's also been a fundamental part of the last 80 years of Oxfam's history, and will continue to be so. So thank you very much to our panellists, Tori, Katie, Amy and Nick. When the Conduit and Oxfam teams put their heads together to find 4 amazing activists, we could have come to many of you in the audience, but I'm glad we came to you guys because you've been really challenging but inspiring, and so thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you to everyone here and online for being part of marking this bittersweet moment, I suppose, in Oxfam's own journey. Please stay on if you're here, and continue the conversation, and bye-bye if you're online.